Hi everyone, Terrible Dactyl here and welcome back to Jurassic Plastic. This is another edition of the Jurassic Plastic Retrospective, the series in which we take a look at all the different models of certain species that a specific company has produced through the years. And today, as you can see, we are taking a look at Carnotaurus. Specifically all the Carnos that have been made by Safari Ltd. Once again, I just want to mention that I'm going to be covering mainline models here, not necessarily minis, things from the tubes or authentics lines or things like that. While those are interesting, the fact is I don't have a lot of them in my collection, and honestly, a lot of them are basically just shrunken down versions of the larger models anyway. So with that said, let's start with the first Safari Carnotaurus, which is this slightly goofy looking, to be honest, one here from the Carnegie Collection. Now, as you can see on the information stamp on the bottom, this is the original Carnegie Carnotaurus. It was produced in 1996 for a 1997 release. And, well, there are quite a few issues with this model. And adding insult to injury, it should be pointed out that this Safari Carno came out at about the same time as the way superior and similarly posed, actually, Batat Carno. And the Batat Carno is still one of my favorites. I know this is not a Safari figure, and I just said that the retrospective was going to focus on one company, but just for the sake of comparison, the Batat one should kind of be compared to the original Safari Carno, just because they came out at about the same time, they're about the same scale. Both of these were advertised as 140 scale, and if you measure by length, they do line up with about 140. However, both of them, the Safari one more so, has a head which is a little bit too big. If you look at modern reconstructions of Carnotaurus, the head is actually relatively small compared to the rest of the body. And it's really noticeable, especially on the Carnegie one, because the head is just really goofy in how large it is. It's almost like a Tyrannosaur type proportions here. It's just, this is a really weird, almost like it looks like a knockoff, let's be honest. This is not the best Safari sculpt. It kind of looks like the head you'd see on a Chinosaur, like one of those old, like hollow, like Imperial Plastics dinosaurs where it just had like this gaping mouth with big googly eyes and a head that was a little bit too big for its body. And, otherwise the detail is not bad. It's got these nice little osteoderms along the back, which is accurate. So it's not all bad. The head is appropriately narrow and hatchet-shaped. The legs are the appropriate length, although as we'll talk about more with the newer Safari one, they look like they're probably a little bit under-muscled, a little bit too slim. The whole body, it is a little bit too slim based on modern standards, but once again, this is a 1996 sculpt. The paint scheme is okay. It's nice. It's kind of a subdued pattern. I don't know if there's very much to say about it. It's a little bit boring, honestly, but, I prefer that to the repaint, which we'll talk about in a minute. But, yeah, overall, it's just a really goofy-looking model. The overall effect is not great. And when you had Batat coming out at the same time in the same scale with a model like this one, which has the osteoderms in actually probably a much more accurate position compared to the Carnegie one, where they're kind of spaced out and spread all around the tail. The tail is wider. It looks like it's got more meat on it. It looks more appropriate to, a living, breathing animal with the wrinkle details, the less goofy eye, the smaller eye, more well-defined muscles, a much nicer paint job, even though it's less, interesting. It doesn't have as many little stripes and details. I think the subtlety of the blending here with, well, this is not the original one, obviously. The original one had that really cool red and black. But still, this is just a way better Carno. And to this day, I think at this scale, this is the best one that you're going to find, except for maybe, the Collect Day version, which is relatively new. But this one still holds up. This one looks really close to the original Steven Zerkis life-size model that was done. It's just better in pretty much every respect. This was in the end of the 90s. This was pretty much when I started to think, I think Carnegie used to be it, but I think there's kind of losing that it factor when you had things like this coming out at the same time as clearly superior sculpts like that. Now, Carnegie obviously did update their Carnotaurus in 2007, about 10 years later. We got the same sculpt with just an even weirder paint job, basically. It's dark green with neon green and some kind of brown. What is that, like baby poop brown on the bottom? It's the exact same sculpt. You can see it's got the exact same info stamp on the bottom. And the detail is a little bit better. If you compare the face, this one is clearly a better face, but the eye is just still way too big. This looks like a weird alien piranha or something. Increasing the detail, I think, just even makes it look weirder, because at least this one with the big googly eyes, you can kind of think it's a sloppy paint application. But this one really does a lot more to highlight the intricate sculpting on the wrinkles and things around the face and the eyelids. And you can just see how ridiculously huge and honestly probably a little bit misplaced. It looks too far forward in the skull, even though I guess it's in about the right spot. I don't know, it's just the size. Something about it just looks wrong. And repainting it, it did give this model a second life with a more colorful paint application. Obviously is going to help it sell better. But once again, there's just something seriously wrong with the sculpt. The head is way too large. It's way too goofy looking. The arms are too large and they stick out like a little teddy bear. And yeah, that's Safari's first two attempts at the Carnotaurus were not great. Now, a few years later, Safari did take another crack at upgrading the Carnotaurus, aside from just the paint job this time, and we got one of my favorite Carnegie Collection models of all time. That is the 2010 Carno. The 2010 Carno is one of the nicest, most detailed Carnegie Collection models I think that they ever produced. It's just far and away better than the older one, and the detail on it is very, very nice. The wrinkly texture, this is like the epitome of a Forrest Rogers sculpt. I really love all the different washes that you have on here. This is from the late 2000s era of Carnegie, where they were doing a lot of these like layered, very lightly applied paint washes on a lot of their figures. The proportions are way, way better. It's got an appropriately small head. If you compare that to the old one, you can see it's far less goofy looking. The proportions of the arms are better compared to the body. The tail is a little longer. And overall, I think this is one of the best Carnotaurus figures ever made. Some people would argue still that this is the best Carno that you can get. And that is attested by the fact that it's really hard to still get this. Even just looking on eBay, I very rarely see these pop up. I think the people that have them are hanging on to them. These things are a dime a dozen. You can get the old Carno, whether green or gray, on eBay for like probably less than $10, especially if it doesn't have the tag, because it's just been upgraded so many times. Nobody really needs this for their collection when they probably also have this, and nobody is selling this. If you have this, you're hanging on to it, and if this pops up on eBay, it's going to be for a lot of money, because it's a beautiful model. The color scheme is amazing. The sculpting is amazing. It's one of the best Carnegie figures that has ever been made. There are a few questionable choices, like, the rose gold teeth. I don't know why they did that. It's kind of cool. It almost looks like it's feeding on something, like it's got a little blood stained on its teeth or something like that. it's just a really great and beautiful model. However, and I might cause some controversy for this opinion, especially since this is really a Carnegie-focused YouTube channel, I think that the 2019 most recent Safari Carnotaurus does surpass the last version of the Carnegie Carnotaurus. Let me tell you why. Plenty of reviews have been focused on this model, so I don't want to do like a full review of the paint details and everything like that, but I do want to talk about my general impression of this newest Safari Carnotaurus. Clearly, it is 1,000% better than the previous Carnegie version. I mean, there is simply no comparison between these two figures. It's like, this is a toy you'd find at a dollar bin at Five Below, and this is a sculpture. This thing is absolutely beautiful. The skin texture is great. You can see that the osteoderm placement is much more accurate, much more like the Batat, with the osteoderm spread farther apart and wrapping all the way around to the ventral side of the tail and onto the legs and onto the chest. The sculpt on the head is way better with that beautifully sculpted, appropriately sized eye with beautiful gloss applied to it. It has lips this time, which some people don't like, but I think makes it look that much more naturalistic, especially when you compare it to the lipless horror of this piranha face thing with all these snaggle teeth evenly sized poking out from seemingly the exterior of the face. This is just far and away such an upgrade. The arms are appropriately small. I think it looks like they're appropriately buried within the soft tissue and musculature of the pectoral girdle here. The feet and legs have been criticized for being too thick, but if you look at some skeletal reconstructions of Carnotaurus, it does have like this really huge knobby protrusion near the knee. And I honestly don't think this one, or even the Batat, or even the Collecte one, have thick enough legs to account for those large muscle attachment sites. A lot has been made about some recent headlines that describe Carnotaurus as, you know, a Cretaceous cheetah, and so it should have long, thin runner's legs like a cheetah's legs. I don't think that's what those headlines were talking about. Those headlines describing this thing as a Cretaceous cheetah were not saying that it had long, skinny legs like a cat. These are appropriately sized. The ankle area, the tarsus here, does look a little thick, but I think it's appropriately thick. I think you don't want to shrink wrap that tarsus too much. It's going to have some really strong ligaments in there that need to be covered by relatively thick and durable skin, which is beautifully rendered on the feet here with that little overlap of skin over the toes. Obviously, theropod feet and the tarsus was very wide laterally like this, and they were relatively skinny in this direction, but I think that you do need it to be wrapped in a decently significant amount of soft tissue like it is here. Obviously, based on the big knobby knee bone protrusions, you're going to want a huge, big, wide drumstick just like we've got here. And obviously the thigh is very appropriately well muscled. I think the leg proportions and the leg musculature is actually better on this one. That study that the Cretaceous cheetah headlines came from was really in reference to the tail musculature. And the tail musculature in theropods is what really drives the leg motion. The locomotion of the upper legs were connected to the tail via these massive muscles, which you can absolutely see reflected here very, very well in this model. The tail is thick, it's beefy, it's really what all theropod or even all dinosaur tails should really be like. The other thing people get wrong about those headlines that were circulating a year or two ago is that this is something specific to Carnotaurus. You know, a lot of these reporters don't really get it. They're describing Carnotaurus as a Cretaceous cheetah. It's got these massive, massive tail muscles to help it run really super fast. But this was a new way of interpreting the cross-section of theropod tails in general. Carnotaurus does have a particularly beefy tail, but it's not exactly like out of the park unusual compared to other theropods. The take-home idea is that this tail is accurate, and a tail like this is absolutely under-muscled, shrink-wrapped. The legs, like I said before on this one, are probably a little too thin. They don't have room for the appropriate musculature that a really fast Cretaceous cheetah, or whatever you want to say, would have, whereas this one is more appropriate. This one is more muscular overall. It is less shrink-wrapped. I'm not going to say shrink-wrapping is always inappropriate. You can find examples of that in modern animals. But when it comes to the locomotor assembly of these dinosaurs, this is what I would like to see in every theropod model going forward. I think they should all have a beefy tail like this, big thick leg muscles, appropriate tendons and folds of thick heavy skin around the feet. This is really the new ideal, and I actually held off on getting the 2019 Carno model for a while because I love the 2010 Carnegie so much, and I thought, you know what, it's not going to be a replacement for this. This just says Carnotaurus to me. But now that I have this one in hand, and I was actually able to buy this on Amazon recently for less than $10, which is a steal, and I really hope that the kind of negative reviews of this model are not hurting its performance at retail, because having this in hand and looking at it and thinking about how this really reflects all of our most current knowledge of how theropods like Carnotaurus were put together, this is probably the best modern safari figure, in my opinion. I would say that this Carno is it. No small praise, right? I mean, for scientific accuracy, just for detailing, for how beautiful his sculpting is. I even really love the color scheme. I know that, the little airbrushy crosshatch stripes can be funky on some of these safaris. I don't really like the airbrushing details, but on this one I think it actually works because they're subtle, they're blended enough, and with the pose you can't really tell what's going on with them. I love the orangey head. I pretty much love everything about this figure. Safari really knocked it out of the park, and looking at the Collecti Carno, looking at the newer revealed Rebor ones that look like they're just copies of the Disney dinosaur Carno. I don't think this one has yet to be topped, and whoever does top it is going to have a really hard time. As far as scale goes, like I said earlier, the original Carnegies obviously were originally advertised as 140, and if you measure along the spine and you do the scale conversion, they do come out to be 140. However, for obvious reasons, the proportions on the old Carnegies are just super messed up. The head is way, way too big. I kind of prefer, when I'm setting up a diorama of a particular scale, to have the animal look like it would look compared to the other animals, or even if I have like a little human figurine in my display or something, I want it to look like if I was standing next to the actual skeleton of that animal, this is how it would be represented. So I want to go by something like a limb length or a skull length, or basically go with whatever aspect or body part of that model is closest to scale with my other figurines. So if you measure the old Carnegie from where about the back of the skull would be to the front, it's 2 centimeters. Now that actually turns out to be closer to 135 or even closer to 130 scale. The basic reason for that is because proportionally the head is way too large on these Carnegies. It should be much, much smaller. If you compare it to a 140 Mark's Caveman, you can see Carnotaurus' head is nowhere near that large compared to a human. It should be much, much smaller than this. So the proportions really affect how you scale it. That's why I prefer to scale measuring based on a particular, like skull length or tibia length, or something that is a known element of the skeleton. Turning to the larger figures, their skulls are actually not that much smaller. This skull on, no, let me focus it here. This skull on the original 2010 larger Carnegie is only like 2.25 centimeters long. Its head is almost the same size. Look at that. It's almost the same size as the original Carnegie. That's how much this was out of proportion. That's how badly the head was oversized on this. So, if you ask me, these two figures are about the same scale because their head size is about the same. Once again, way too big for a 140 figure. Closer to 130 for this one. And if you really wanted to get technical with it, I would put this probably in a display with 1/25th scale models, like for example my Safari Mastodon, which is 1/25. I think scales very nicely alongside these Carnos. I think that's probably a good representation of their size comparison there. And this one is even closer to 1/25, which seems to be Doug Watson's preferred scale, is somewhere between 1/25 and 1/30. This Mastodon is not quite 1/25, it's not quite 1/30, somewhere in between. I don't remember the exact scale, but you know, that's close enough to fudge it. There's going to be individual size variations between that range. So I think the scale comparison for these, I would say between 1/25 and 1/30 for the later Carnegie one, and for the newest 2019 Safari. And ironically, same scale for this, unless you really care about body size, in which case they are, you know, about 140. You just have to imagine that it's got a hyper large head for an animal of its size. So there you have it. This is your retrospective on the various incarnations of Safari Ltd's Carnotaurus. If you like this video, if you appreciate my other videos, please make sure you hit that like button, give me a subscribe, leave a comment, and I will see you next time on Jurassic Plastic.